Part 4: Reincarnation and the Impressionless Equipoise of Consciousness. During the course of evolution of its consciousness, the soul, Atma, while consciously identifying itself with varied, finite gross forms, was also simultaneously, though unconsciously, identifying itself with its finite subtle form and its finite mental form, which associated with the soul in compact, homogeneous, unconscious alliance throughout the entire course of evolution of consciousness, right from the first urge. Although the soul frequently and consciously dissociated itself from the finite gross forms, which acted as media to experience the impressions gained in the course of evolving greater and higher consciousness, the soul could never dissociate itself consciously or unconsciously, directly or indirectly, from its finite subtle form and its finite mental form. On the contrary, while the soul dissociated its identification with any one medium of finite gross form, it was the unconscious association of soul with its finite subtle form that fortified the soul, now without any gross medium, with finite energy, the driving force, to give a tendency to the consciousness of the soul towards identifying itself with the next medium of the next finite gross form, in order to experience the impressions of the last dissociated finite gross form, retained and reflected by the finite mental form of this soul. It is but natural that, together with the evolution of higher and greater consciousness of soul, the evolution of the finite subtle form of soul also takes place to fortify the soul with greater finite energy, to incline the consciousness of the more and more gross conscious soul to identify itself with higher and higher types of finite gross forms, evolved by the impressions of the last lower finite gross form. Similarly, the evolution of the finite mental form of the soul also takes place simultaneously to accommodate, retain, and reflect the increasingly innumerable varied impressions gained and gathered by the evolution of greater and greater consciousness of the soul. Thus it is that, when the soul tends to identify itself with varied species of vegetable forms, the evolved finite subtle form and the evolved finite mental form of the soul begin to show greater and visible signs of the soul's association with its much evolved finite subtle form and finite mental form in the shape of varied, rapid cycles of changes taking place in vegetable forms, and also in the shape of vegetable forms showing first signs of peculiar, varied, and meaningful tendencies of self-preservation and survival of the fittest. In the worm, bird, and fish forms, this tendency of the finite mental form of the soul is translated gradually and steadily into the shape of instinct, until in the animal form this instinct is fully manifested as one of the finite aspects of the finite mental form of the soul. Gradually this instinct is further and completely transformed into intellect, this being the highest finite aspect of manifestation of the mental form in the human form of the gross conscious human soul experiencing the gross world. So it is that only in human form are the subtle body and the mental body fully developed, wherefore the soul, associating itself consciously with human form, is, so to speak, fully equipped with a human body, subtle body, and mental body, together with full consciousness of the gross. Although the soul has gained consciousness in human form and thus experiences the gross world, yet the gross conscious human soul is unconscious of the subtle body and so cannot experience the subtle world. It is also unconscious of the mental body and thus cannot experience the mental world. Even though the soul has only gross consciousness and is unconscious of the subtle and mental, it does work through the subtle and mental bodies, although indirectly, on the gross plane. Even though the gross conscious human soul is unconscious of its subtle and mental bodies and their respective subtle and mental worlds, and therefore does not realize the energy of the subtle and the mind of the mental, yet it can use energy through various gross aspects of energy, such as nuclear energy, and it can use mind through various gross aspects of mind, such as desires, emotions, and thoughts. Of these, desires are the predominant aspect of the mind. So this soul, now fully gross conscious of the first, most human gross form, and still unconscious of the subtle and mental, experiences in the gross world the impressions of the last most animal gross form, dissociated or dropped. When all the impressions of the last most animal gross form are exhausted, it is but natural that the first most human gross form is dissociated from the soul. This experience of the soul is universally termed the death of the human being. As explained previously, although this soul is dissociated from the first most human gross form, it is never dissociated from its subtle or its mental forms or bodies. It was also previously explained that though this soul is dissociated from its first most human gross form, the soul retains and experiences through the subtle and mental bodies the impressions of the dropped or dissociated first most human form, and the soul again associates itself with the next most human form to experience the impressions of the previous human form dropped. In fact, the next most human form is nothing but the consolidated mold of the past impressions retained of the previous body or form that dissociated from the soul. Thus the association of the soul with the next most human form is called universally the birth of a human being. The apparent gap between the death and the birth of a human being is that period in which the gross conscious soul, in its association with its fully developed subtle and mental bodies, has experiences of the predominant counterpart of the opposite impressions gathered by the recently dissociated human form. This state of the soul in the apparent gap between death and birth is generally called hell or heaven, and this process of intermittent association and dissociation of consciousness of the conscious soul in human form, now fully conscious, is termed the reincarnation process. If the predominant counterpart of the impressions of opposites, such as virtue and vice, good and evil, male and female, etc., as experienced by the soul, now associated only with the subtle and mental, is of virtue or goodness, i.e., the positive aspect of the opposite impressions, then the soul is said to be in heaven. If it is of vice or evil, i.e., the negative aspect of opposite impressions, then the soul is said to be in hell. The states of heaven and hell are nothing but states of intensive experiences of the consciousness of the soul, experiencing either of the predominant counterparts of the opposite impressions while the soul is dissociated from the gross human body or form. The soul itself does not go to heaven or hell, as is the general belief, because it is eternally infinite and eternally in the Oversoul. It is the consciousness of the soul which experiences the impressions. As soon as the predominant counterpart of impressions is experienced and exhausted, and just when equilibrium is about to be maintained between the opposites of impressions of the last human form that was dropped, at this juncture the soul automatically associates with the next most human form, molded of the consolidated impressions of opposites which were about to be in a state of equilibrium. Thus the gross consciousness of the soul, after experiencing either hell or heaven, associates with the next human form, takes another birth, to experience and exhaust the residual opposite impressions of the last birth. As has already been said, this next human form of the soul is nothing but the consolidated mold of the residual opposite impressions of the last form. It is in this manner that an apparently unending chain of births and deaths of human forms or beings continues to form and dwindle. This is the course of reincarnation in human forms of the soul after it has gained full gross consciousness through the whole series of evolution of the gross consciousness. Right from the unconscious state of the soul, comparable to the deep sleep state of man, until it has gained full gross consciousness, comparable to the wide-open eyes of man in the awake state, while experiencing the gross world, the soul is one, indivisible, infinite, formless, and is eternally in the Oversoul. Throughout the whole process of evolution, reincarnation was an absolutely spontaneous outcome of the first urge, manifested in the unconscious soul, to become conscious of its eternal and infinite self. As has been mentioned already, we can now understand that the cycle of evolution of consciousness, of soul, evolved further and greater consciousness, together with the evolution of forms, of higher and higher types, while exhausting the impressions of the dissociated forms of lower types. Thus the evolution of consciousness of soul apparently causes the soul to identify itself with and gather varied innumerable impressions of higher and higher gross species of forms of the gross world. The clean-cut and major concrete gross forms, after the most first 7 major, most abstract, gaseous, and fluid forms, with which the consciousness of the soul associated, with every leap of greater and greater consciousness, are separated by the 7 leaps from stone to metal, from metal to vegetable, from vegetable to worm, from worm to fish, from fish to bird, from bird to animal, and lastly from animal to human being. The most finite first impression of the first urge gave to the unconscious soul the most finite first consciousness. Gradually, varied impressions gained greater finite consciousness for the soul, and eventually the evolution of consciousness was complete when the soul identified itself with the most first human form. In human form, the soul achieves full and complete consciousness. Therefore, the soul, having now gained full and complete consciousness in human form, does not need any more or any other higher forms to evolve consciousness. This consciousness is full and complete. Though this soul has gained full and complete consciousness, it is still not at all conscious of itself as one, indivisible, eternal, and infinite, and does not experience infinite knowledge, power, and bliss. But it is only fully conscious of its identity with human form and its varied aspects, and experiences the gross world in full. The soul with full consciousness is still unconscious of its original infinite state, because of the unwanted, though necessary, burden of the gross impressions of the human form, from which the consciousness of the soul dissociates as that form drops dead. These impressions of the human form now dead still cling to the full consciousness gained, and as usual, the consciousness of the soul centralizes itself in these gross impressions of the human form just dropped. In trying to unburden consciousness of these impressions, the gross consciousness of the soul tends the soul to experience and exhaust these impressions through innumerable opposite experiences taken through a series of reincarnations. In this process of reincarnation, the consciousness of the soul, while trying to liberate itself from the burden of impressions, gets still further entangled at every stage of reincarnation. When a complete balance of experiences of opposite impressions is just about to be attained, it is just then disturbed by the consciousness of the soul associating itself with the next new human form. Absence of this association would otherwise have neutralized the effect of the impressions by an equal balance of respective opposite experiences, and would thus have liberated the consciousness of the soul from all impressions of opposites. Here the simile of a perfect balance would be appropriate. The consciousness gained by the soul during the process of evolution resembles the indicator at the fulcrum of a perfect balance, and the two pans of the balance are filled with the unequal weights of opposites of impressions, such as virtue and vice, etc. In this way, consciousness, acting like the indicator at the fulcrum, tries to gain equilibrium, which is impossible as long as there are in existence unequal impressions of opposites remaining to be experienced. It is therefore that the gross consciousness of the soul constantly seeks to experience the predominant opposite impressions in order to gain a total equilibrium of the impressions of opposites. But the tragedy is this, that as soon as the gross consciousness of the soul tends to reach the 0 point of equilibrium by gradually experiencing the predominant opposite impressions, it so happens that the consciousness of the soul invariably gets too engrossed in experiencing the predominant opposite impressions and experiences them or exhausts them to such a degree that these predominant opposite impressions are now reduced, i.e., through experience, to such a level that those impressions which were overbalanced by the original predominant opposite impressions, now become predominant, and a great disturbance of balance or equipoise occurs. Wherefore, consciousness, acting like the indicator at the fulcrum, swings or switches in just the opposite direction of its original experience. It is at this juncture that the consciousness of the soul turns towards the experience of the newly predominant opposite impressions through another human form. A human being takes form or birth as a medium to satisfy the demanding need of the consciousness of the soul, which now seeks to exhaust or spend or experience the more predominant opposite impressions. It is but natural that the predominant qualities manifested now by this human soul will be in accordance with the predominant opposite impressions, of which this new human form is but the mold. Thus, in the process of reincarnation, the fully gross conscious human soul, fortified with fully developed subtle and mental bodies, though unconscious of these, must necessarily experience countless varied experiences of impressions of opposites, the impressions which are diametrically opposite in a chain of unending experiences. Through its association with the gross body, the soul seeks to exhaust its previously accumulated opposite impressions, but rarely succeeds in doing so. On the contrary, it often accumulates fresh impressions of opposites. When the gross form is about to exhaust the impressions which brought it into existence, it is dropped. The residual opposite impressions lead the soul to heaven or hell in accordance with the predominance of virtue or vice. In discarnate existence also, all opposite impressions seek to be exhausted through the subjective experiencing of vivified impressions. But even here, in the state of heaven or hell, the equipoise of impressionlessness is generally approximated but missed, and the residual predominant opposite impressions goad the consciousness of the soul to associate with a new gross medium. Complete equipoise is lacking in death as well as in birth. It can only be achieved in the gross world. Therefore, an endless chain of lives in the gross sphere is sustained by residual impressions until consciousness succeeds in getting established in impressionless equipoise. At every stage and in every state of reincarnation, the consciousness of the fully conscious soul gets firmly centralized in the more and more concentrated impressions of human forms with which it has identified and from which it has dissociated. There seems to be no escape from these concentrated impressions. Asterisk. Knowing that creation is not an accident and that it has deeper meaning than is apparent to the eye, the seers of all ages have time and again drawn the attention of the world to the fact that, although for a certain period of his life on this planet, man may identify himself exclusively with the life of the senses, his transcendental destiny is God realization. Maulana Rumi, in his Masnavi, has a parable that illustrates this. The cub of a tiger happened to be reared amongst a flock of sheep. As the cub grew up, it developed all the traits of the sheep, and grazed and bleated like them, so that it never thought of itself as anything different from the sheep. One day, however, a tiger from the jungle approached the one from the flock and said to him, "Do you know that you are a tiger like me and not one of the sheep?" Thereafter he coaxed the strayed tiger to look at its image in a rivulet nearby, and succeeded in enlightening it as to its true nature. The moral of this fable is that man also allows himself to be identified with the world of the senses, and seems to have no way of escape. But there is a way of escape, for eventually a master appears who enlightens him. He is then redeemed and finds himself in the course of time face to face with his ultimate goal, God realization. So I'll just read the sentence that Asterix referred to again. At every stage and in every state of reincarnation, the consciousness of the fully human conscious soul gets firmly centralized in the more and more concentrated impressions of human forms with which it has identified and from which it has dissociated. There seems to be no escape from these concentrated impressions. These impressions must be experienced and exhausted, and the more the impressions are experienced, the more the impressions become concentrated. The only solution to thin out this concentration of impressions is for the consciousness of the fully human conscious soul to experience increasingly and more rapidly these impressions in such a way and in so great a frequency that every impression experienced and the impression that this experience created should be counterbalanced somehow by an opposite impression. Throughout the process of reincarnation, this play of balancing and counterbalancing the opposites of impressions continues, and on this play is sustained the reincarnation process. On this play depends the eventual emancipation of the human conscious soul from the chains of ignorance, and the ultimate realization of self-consciousness. Thus, in the process of reincarnation, the fully gross conscious human soul must necessarily experience innumerable and diverse experiences of impressions of opposites, the impressions which are diametrically opposite, in an apparently unending chain of consistent experiences. Therefore, while the gross conscious human soul, which is now fully conscious, undergoes the experience of opposites in the gross world, the consciousness of the soul has to identify or reincarnate itself a number of times as a male, then as a female, and vice versa, in varied castes, creeds, nationalities, colors, and in different places, as rich one time and then as a pauper, sometimes healthy and sometimes sick, and so forth, all the while reviewing opposite impressions, creating opposite impressions, and simultaneously exhausting them by opposite experiences. It is only through these diverse opposite impressions and their respective opposite experiences that the gross conscious human soul in the gross world could possibly one day, after millions of births and deaths, and through these opposite experiences of births and deaths, be able to balance or thin out the residual or concentrated opposite impressions. Asterisk, a quote by Mir Taqi, Sarapa arzu hone nebanda kardia hamko, vagarna hamkuda, the gardil I be mudua hota. The fact that I am weighed down from head to foot with desires has made a slave of me. I should be God in reality, were my heart and mind desireless. Back to the text. It is this cycle of deaths and consequent births of human forms that ultimately results in inciting the fully evolved consciousness of the gross conscious human soul to involve this consciousness to that depth where the fully involved consciousness of this soul realizes the reality of the infinite eternal state of the self. This process of involution of consciousness gradually takes place as the gross impressions of the opposites gradually become fainter and less concentrated. At this stage, the consciousness of the gross conscious human soul gradually gets dissociated from the gross world as the involution of consciousness enfolds and gradually dissociates from experiencing the impressions of the gross world. This involution of gross consciousness is only possible when the opposite impressions gradually, after a very, very long process, thin out through the process of unfailing reincarnation, which leads to the limit of gross impressions of the opposites and gross experiences of the opposites.